Okay. Thank you all for coming. It turns out that this coronavirus actually sometimes does us, all of us, a lot of good. In particular, it is great to see all of you, always, to see that you are healthy and smiling and happy. But also in the past, when we exposed our wonderful researchers to the world, the crowd was never big enough, at least not for me. So the wonderful thing about the webinars is everybody can show up. So it works a lot better, and nobody needs to move from his or her chair. Ayala drags me from my office to this nicer environment, but other than that, it's a really a wonderful way to communicate. But more importantly, over the last 5 years since Boris Mints had made the decision to help us with this generous gift to do all of these wonderful things that we are now doing, we've been quite successful. We have had some serious successes that we're proud of, and we want to show off. We want to share these with the world. So today we have gathered here to share this wonderful thing that we have done together. But since the Institute is always mostly engaged, as it should be, with global challenges, I've asked two significant new highly placed scholars at Tel Aviv University to talk about two different challenges that the university is facing. And therefore, I've asked Professor Milette Shamir to talk about how do you manage and how do you move forward with international activities when the skies are closed and there are so many other challenges in terms of moving people around and making people meet. And then I've asked Liat Kishon-Rabin, our new Dean of Innovation in Teaching, to talk about this new challenge of teaching online. So since I see that Milette has joined us, I will, I should just, on a personal note, you know, Milette has helped us so much in the last 2 or 3 months since she took office. And just a huge thank you, Milette, for being exactly what you are. And please take the floor.
Thank you, Itai. Thank you for these words, and thank you for the opportunity to address this audience and to join you in celebrating what I understand is now the 6th year of activities at the Boris Mints Institute. It's really impressive. I guess what I would like to talk a little bit more than the actual day-to-day challenges of internationalizing the university during the COVID-19 crisis is to try to explain what the vision is behind internationalizing the university and what it is that we see as our goal and why we're so eager to internationalize the university at this point. These seem like self-evident concepts, but maybe I could say just a few words about how the university is formulating its strategy these days. So as many of you, I think, already know, a little over a year ago, a new president was elected to head Tel Aviv University, Professor Ariel Porat. And one of the main goals, I think at the very top of his platform, maybe the main goal, was to dramatically increase within 5 years Tel Aviv University's global connectivity and global profile. Of course, Tel Aviv University, as we know, has for many years been a leading university in Israel in terms of international presence. We have hundreds of collaboration agreements with universities all over the world. Our researchers, do collaborative work with their colleagues abroad. Something I'm particularly proud of is that we are able to bring around 2,000 international students each year to campus to join in our international programs. So there's been a lot of international activity. But I think what President Porat understood is that there's still a very large and untapped potential for turning Tel Aviv University into a truly global university with significant and meaningful connections with leading institutions all around the world, and a thriving international community on campus. Not so much, again, at the time of lockdown and COVID-19, but some of that presence, of course, can also take the form of digital and virtual presence. So as a first step towards this goal, what we did as a university is really try to clarify for ourselves what we mean by internationalization and why we want it. Why do we need to invest a lot of resources and energies in this thing that is pretty vague called internationalizing the university? And we've gone through a process of actually a few months of thinking about that and sharpening our focus and our strategy. And I'm not going to share with you the entire process, but maybe I can say just a few words about some of the conclusions that we've reached. So the fundamental question is why invest significant resources in making the university more international? And the answer may seem self-evident to many of you, but it really isn't. And let me give you an example, or actually two examples of positions that I think many people hold of why investing in internationalization is actually not a great thing. One position is something that I will call for now the natural outcome position. And that is the position that argues that internationalization is an outcome of academic excellence. In other words, universities become international because their research that they produce is superb, and this attracts global partners, and the university doesn't really need to do anything in order to internationalize itself. It doesn't need to invest in internationalization. It needs to invest in research, and the rest will just happen. Our vision at Tel Aviv University is a challenge to this argument. We have now been able to define for ourselves that internationalization is a platform for excellence in research. It's not an outcome of excellence in research. Internationalization doesn't just happen on its own, or doesn't happen sufficiently well on its own, and it doesn't matter how excellent our individual researchers are. Internationalization, for our research to really benefit by global connections, we need to create at Tel Aviv University a full international ecosystem. And we create this ecosystem because we bear internationalization in mind with every decision that we make, from the faculty that we hire, through the courses that we teach, the way that administration works, and all the way to the way that campus looks. So whether we're in a time of COVID crisis or not, our work at the moment is really to try to understand how to create this ecosystem and do so successfully, precisely so that it will have a dramatic impact on the research that we do here, and both the quality and the global visibility of that research. So a large part of our strategy involves the creation of this ecosystem, which is a very complicated thing. A second argument against kind of a heavy investment in internationalization is something that we may be able to call the utilitarian argument. And this argument says we should invest in internationalizing the university, but only to the extent that the benefits of this internationalization are clearly measurable. For example, if we want to have our international rankings go up, and we can invest money in internationalization in order to achieve that, that is a way, that is a kind of a rationale for this investment. or if the income of the university grows because we bring a lot of international students, then that is a rationale for internationalizing the university. And here too, I want to present the vision of Tel Aviv University as a departure from this utilitarian model. I think that the rationale that we developed for the investment that we are now directing towards internationalization is, of course, it would be lovely to go up in the international rankings and to have thousands and thousands more international students, but that does not sum it up. Internationalization has a higher and a more significant purpose for us. It needs to be embedded in the university system of values, even in its ethical DNA. So what are the kind of values that are associated with internationalizing Tel Aviv University? Firstly, of course, an educational ideal. We have an obligation, I think, to our students to provide them with an education that would help turn them into world citizens, that will give them a broad and cosmopolitan and multinational perspective, and the ability and the skills to navigate in a world that is very quickly becoming increasingly global. So to meet that goal, we really have to begin to build plans for creating opportunities for our students for international mobility. And here, COVID-19 is, of course, a limit, but it's also an opportunity, because whereas in the past, our students were able to travel and take a semester abroad, but only some of our students, students who had money, students who had time, students whose schedules allowed for that. Now there is an increasing emphasis on virtual mobility, on the ability to learn at another university without actually going there. And that opens up this idea of mobility, this ideal of mobility, to many, many, many students who before the current crisis did not have this opportunity. So that's one value that I personally am very much invested in, this creation, this pedagogical project of giving our students the opportunity to become global citizens. And I'll just mention one more value that is high on our list, and with that I will close. Making a contribution on the world stage. The knowledge produced here at Tel Aviv University, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about engineering or economics or biomedicine or public policy or philosophy, can and of course does make an impact on the world. It joins knowledge that is produced in other academic centers all around the globe, bringing everyone together and bringing everyone one step further in dealing with the world's most acute problems. And of course, nowadays, we hardly need a reminder of how crucial international academic collaborations are for saving human lives. The university needs to kind of actively encourage this kind of international collaboration and to have contribution to the world's well-being set as one of its primary goals. And of course, this is also where the Boris Mints Institute comes in with its mission to bring positive change to the world. The Boris Mints Institute and the leadership of this institute they're so deeply committed to internationalization, I see them as really key players in our strategy in the next few years to international Tel Aviv University. So I congratulate the Institute for everything that it has already achieved. And I very much look forward to a future of us working together to promote Tel Aviv University as a global university, and to do so for all the right reasons, to promote excellence in research, to equip our students with tools that they need to thrive in the world, and to make a real contribution to solving the world's problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milette. We really appreciate your contribution. And we really appreciate working with you on a daily basis. Thank you. Liat, are you on? I'm not sure I see.
Yes, I'm on.
Okay, so Liat, I just should say that Liat has taken upon herself the impossible task of turning Tel Aviv into an online university in 3 weeks with no resources. So this is literally, you're looking at as a magic. And I asked Liat to talk to us a little bit about the challenge and how she deals with it. Thank you, Liat, for joining us.
First of all, hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you all and meet you all. For me, it's the first time I meet the Boris Institute and this distinguished faculty here. I come actually from the Faculty of Medicine. I used to head the School of Health Professions. So for me, being here with you is a first time, actually. And also thank you for your warm introduction. Although, Itai, I have to admit, the magic will be only when things will actually happen, and we're really trying very hard to make them happen. It's true that this position is totally new. For those who know or don't know, Tel Aviv University is considered, let's say, a relatively old university in Israel terms. The Hebrew University was first, but Tel Aviv University is from the 60s. And being as such, and also being the biggest in terms of the number of students, 30,000 students, it's considered, as someone told me, a heavy ship. And as such, changing things in a heavy ship is not obvious. It takes a lot, especially where people have old habits, and changing habits is something that is not an easy thing to do. You know, even if somebody change our cheese or piece of cheese from one place for another, we're already on our back feet, especially if you're a researcher. And for many, many, many years, we've been always told that we only can get promoted if we have come up with great ideas, think out of the box, publish, get grants, be international. All these things are wonderful. And yet the teaching part was left somewhat behind. The last few years, there was a little bit more about the teaching, and that's a lot of it was probably economical because there was a lot of competition from the colleges, from other universities. We were all trying to get to the same students, and maybe there was a little bit more emphasis on that. Truthfully, this position came out, I guess, less than a year ago. And I was offered it actually before Corona days, before the COVID-19 days. And at first, when it was offered to me, I was thinking, why would somebody from the health professions would be able to or be interested in a job like this? And it turned out that it's actually a multifaceted answer, but it gives you an idea how this question is actually more relevant to everybody, regardless of what they do. I actually come from the research areas where we try to develop the brain, the human brain from a baby. How does it develop the language? How does it develop the auditory system? How they both interrelate? And we know that learning skills is something that requires a lot of engagement from the baby, from the infant, not explicit engagement, but a lot of practice and engagement. And this is a learning skill. And when you think about learning in terms of students, true that for many years we thought that, we knew that universities had the position and had the role of disseminating knowledge and also making knowledge, creating knowledge via research. But with all the technology that's going on these days, it's clear that that part of the university, the dissemination of knowledge, is not unique to the university. You can do it through any mobile phone. Children are doing it much. Everything I ask in 2 seconds, my younger kids already have the answers. There's no need in that sense to actually study at the university. So one of our goals is to understand now what is the added value of the university, and more importantly, actually what kind of a student and a being or a person in this world we would like it to be in order to engage to all the wonderful thing the Boris Mints Institute is doing and anything else that promotes us to be a better place for the future. And for me, being a good learner and having good learning skills is very close to also being a good researcher. it's true that not every good researcher has the charisma and can take after him, engage students to listen to him. But I really do believe that if you are a good student in terms of the way you think and you can instill these skills in a student, he will become a better researcher and will be able to develop things and create things, think out of the box. And really the sky's the limit in that sense. So when I did accept the job, I said, wow, this is a wonderful opportunity. I guess little did I know how difficult this is going to be on one hand. On the other hand, a lot of things happened on the way that actually made me be an optimist. One thing is not something good that happened, and that's obviously the COVID-19 that kind of really accelerated things. And if previously, and I was one of them, I admit, I thought I would retire before ever going on Zoom in order to teach, things turned around, and I was the first one that had to make these changes. So that definitely accelerated things. And what happened is that we went from regular frontal teaching as an old school, relatively old school in Israel, where we teach only in class and nobody can replace a teacher and so forth and so forth. Over one night, we had to go on Zoom and actually present our presentations and do whatever we can. I come from a school where there's a lot of other courses that are not necessarily frontal. There's also labs, there's also clinical placements. So a lot of these things we had to be creative and come with some kind of an alternative. And it turns out that there is an alternative. The other thing that made me a little bit more optimistic is the fact that I found a very open-minded staff, the senior staff members, that I thought that would be much hesitant to make the change. And after the first leap that they did last semester, they were actually eager to make this change. So at this point, there are a few challenges that we're facing. One is the immediate challenge, which is how to have the coming semester, how do we teach it better? How do we teach it better in the sense that the students are going to be better learners? And Itai said the unit is called Innovations of Teaching. It's actually called Innovation of Teaching and Learning, because we prefer emphasizing the learning part and not only the teaching part, because one is the other side of the coin. So these are immediate goals that we've kind of got into immediately. Another more, I guess it's more of a long-term goal, but we need to start it right now, is our vision. What is the added benefit of a university? Why is it important? Is it really being just online? Are we going to become another online university, online courses only? Or we think that there is an added value, and this is something that we need to develop and see which courses are relevant to this, which courses are important to exchange ideas, to have engagement with the students, to have them come up and talk, write better. These are all things that the media or the iPhone or the WhatsApp and all these digital social devices are not promoting in terms of language development, and more important, thinking and being able to clearly bring your thoughts into words. And I think if you don't have a clear mind and clear ability to actually express it, you're going to have a difficulty in many other things. And we don't know yet what is the outcome of all these things that happen right now. But I think it will have outcomes. Some will be negative, some will be positive. But I think as a university where we have all the great minds to actually analyze this and come up with these ideas, how do we make sure to minimize the negative things and support the positive things? I think we should put the student in the center in terms of its learning. If today I can walk out and do sports and all these iPhones and gadgets can tell me I'm in the right cardiac thing, and I'm in the right heart thing, and in the right blood pressure, and so forth. I'm sure we have the ability, and I know that there are already companies working on it. How do we use artificial intelligence also to let the student know where he or she is at this point of his studying? And I think that's something that we can promote and make sure that Tel Aviv University will not only be first place in research and internationalism, but also it will be first place in teaching. And I think that is something that together we should be able to do it. And in that sense, I think I'm very happy with Milette, we already have talked, and also with Itai, because clearly being better able to use online teaching, online courses, ability to use the platform, the technology, and that's something we'll have to work on, improving infrastructure, that we can have all these ideas, exchange of thoughts in a much better and increase our globalization in that sense. So we need to assess ourselves. We have to see whether what we're doing is right or wrong, and improving ourselves all the time. These are all things that this unit that we're now working on putting all the little bits support subunits that worked on the university without one roof on top and one leadership to do it. But this is something that we can work only with the whole campus together. And I'm very, very much looking forward to working with Itai and his staff. We already had some previous discussions about it. And I hope we will be able to, next time we talk, if you invite me again, we can actually say what is that we were able to do. So thank you very much for listening. It's magic, but I know that together we can make it happen. And I'm going to wish you all a continuing enjoy the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Liat. I said it's magic. I just want to say a couple more words, and then I'll turn it over to the young generation. We have some very exciting young researchers, but just the ability of Liat to run a training program that she put together over the summer. It was just wonderful to kind of do this kind of learning by doing. This program that in the end kind of trains the entire staff of Tel Aviv University to just be better at teaching online. And the project that Liat and Milette and I are working on right now is a program, an international program that will be taught entirely online on the science of weather and climate change. So it will be a great program. The three of us are really excited. And hopefully by the next time we, all three of us meet with all of you right now watching, we'll be able to show some initial progress on this very exciting program. I should just mention very briefly and welcome Segenet, who is always a wonderful collaborator, and we understand that she's listening, so I wanted to really welcome the head of ICIPE in Kenya. It is always so exciting to have you with us. And now, with no further ado, I will turn the floor to Eve, who will actually moderate the discussion of the four young scholars that will now talk. Three are young recruits that have just began to receive support from the Institute. And of course, our one and only Karen, who just finished and completed her PhD with the support of the program and is starting, as we speak, her postdoc at Potsdam in Germany. Eve is our second year PhD student that you all know. So thank you very much, Liat, and thank you very much, Milette and Eve, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today at this 2020 Boris Mints Institute webinar. And I would like to take the opportunity to issue an enormous thanks both to Boris Mints, our fearless leader, to Itai and to Ayelet for organizing this, to all the members of the board for their continued support and dedication to solving these global problems that we are dedicating our lives to solving as researchers. And thank you very much to Professor Shamir and to Professor Kishon-Rabin. As a student at Tel Aviv University, I feel confident, aspirational, and inspired by the strong female leadership at our university. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for your presentations. And now we're going to move to the second part of the program, where we're going to hear from some of our fantastic scholars that we have at the Boris Mints Institute, new scholars. So the first three are new scholars as part of our program that are going to give us just a little bit of a taste of what they're working on. And then, as Itai said, we're going to hear from Karen, who Magia lach kapayim, mazal tov on unfinished your doctorate. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Boaz Meiri, who will be presenting to us a lecture entitled Psychological Interventions for Promoting Intergroup Conflict Resolution. He is an active member of our Department of Public Policy and the Conflict Resolution Program. So Dr. Meiri, blow our minds, please.
Thank you so much, Eve. So let me just share my screen first. Okay. So hello, everybody. My name is Boaz Meiri. I'm a new researcher in the Boris Mints Institute and a new faculty member at the Evans Program in Conflict Resolution and Mediation at Tel Aviv University. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to meet you all, albeit virtually. And I'm very happy for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my research in the past few years. So in 2016, the Colombian government and the leadership of the FARC guerrilla movement signed a peace deal to end an internal conflict that has claimed the lives of nearly 250,000 people since its inception in the 1950s. However, when the treaty was presented to the Colombians in a national referendum, it was rejected by a margin of less than 0.5%, or specifically around 50,000 votes among more than 13 million votes cast, leaving Colombia on the brink of peace, but with uncertainty surrounding a potential end to the conflict. Indeed, despite considerable diplomatic efforts with political elites to achieve peace, the populace remains worried. Thus, while one potential resolution to internal conflicts is through diplomatic efforts by political leaders, even if political leaders broker a peace deal, without the support of the populace, peace may be difficult to institute and maintain. So the events in Colombia exemplify the main two research questions that I focus on in my research. First, what are the different psychological barriers to attitude change and conflict resolution? Or in other words, why was it the case that even though a peace deal was reached in Colombia, many Colombians actually rejected it? And two, how can we take psychological knowledge and develop psychological interventions to address these barriers and promote better intergroup relations and conflict resolution? So today I'd like to give you a broad overview of my research and then talk in some more depth about one research I've been involved in the past couple of years, a research that started during my postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. So just as a broad introduction, research on attitude change for the past approximately 100 years clearly indicates that changing attitudes is a major challenge that intensifies when the attitudes in questions have moral or ideological foundations or are related to individuals' identities. So these can be, for example, attitudes towards contentious issues such as abortion, global warming, gender roles, eating meat, etc. Such attitudes are sometimes called frozen, which means that it is very hard to change them with information that tries to challenge them. I'd also like to argue that contexts of violent and prolonged conflict, sometimes called intractable in the literature, pose an even more difficult challenge, as attitudes toward the conflict and the enemy are actually learned from a very early age, even from the day we were born, actually, through various socialization channels such as schools and the media. and violent events that happen constantly reinforce these held attitudes throughout the years of the conflict. In context of such intergroup or intractable conflicts, these frozen attitudes, in essence, maintain the conflict and the intergroup hostility. These attitudes in this context can be, for example, the perception that we are moral while the other side is immoral, that we are the true victims while the other side just tries to harm us, that we only strive for peace while the other side is not a real partner for peace. During war or violence, these attitudes are adaptive and functional, as they can help individuals cope with the tremendous psychological hardship that is the result of the conflict. However, when there's a real opportunity for peace, as was in Colombia, these attitudes become a barrier for peace since they are frozen and lead to biased information processing. So the bottom line of this is that a major challenge that practitioners and academics face is to try to unfreeze these barriers and lead to openness to new alternative information regarding the conflict, regarding the enemy, or regarding the in-group. So from the extensive research that was done on psychological barriers, mostly in Stanford by Lee Ross and colleagues, and in Israel by Dani Bartal, Eran Halperin and colleagues, I'll briefly state two examples from my own contribution. First, together with Dani Bartal and other colleagues, I studied self-censorship, an important social phenomenon that has great importance in context of intergroup conflicts because it blocks free flow of information that can show the conflict in a different light, shed light on different atrocities, and expose injustices. In this research, I examined different contextual and individual variables that affect the willingness to self-censorship, and also what are the consequences of actually engaging in self-censorship. In a more recent line of work, together with Emil Bruneau and Samantha Moorberg at the University of Pennsylvania, we examined the notion of meta-perceptions, or how I think others think of me. And we found that negative meta-perceptions are associated with more hostile attitudes in various contexts all over the world, and importantly, that these meta-perceptions are much more negative than the perceptions are in reality. So for example, in one study, we found that both Democrats and Republicans think that the other side is at least twice as much more prejudiced toward them than they actually are. As mentioned, the second question that interests me is about interventions and how we can take the psychological knowledge on barriers such as meta-perception, such as self-censorship, and use that in order to develop interventions that can unfreeze attitudes and promote attitude change and conflict resolution. In the past few years, I've been involved in research that assess different types of interventions, but today I'd like to give you just a couple of examples. I'd argue that my main contribution to the literature on intervention is an approach that I developed during my PhD together with Dani Bartal and Eran Halperin. We termed paradoxical thinking. Briefly, in a nutshell, differently than most interventions that attempt to persuade individuals using inconsistent information, paradoxical thinking is actually the attempt to change beliefs and attitudes using messages that are consistent or congruent with the held beliefs and attitudes of the person we're trying to change his or her attitudes. But these messages are provided in an amplified, exaggerated, or sometimes even an absurd manner. And this should hopefully get individuals to realize the absurdity in their held beliefs and attitudes or the absurdity in the current situation. This intervention was found to be effective in promoting unfreezing and more openness, and more positive intergroup attitudes, especially among the more resistant individuals or individuals who are more adamant in their held beliefs and attitudes. It was also examined in various contexts, mostly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also in other contexts, such as Germans' attitudes toward Muslim asylum seekers. The second approach I've been working on, starting more recently during my postdoc, is debiasing or correcting misperceptions in general and meta-perceptions in particular. In one research I was involved in, we showed that a semester-long intergroup contact between Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa and non-Muslim Americans over an online platform significantly reduces negative meta-perceptions among both Muslim and American participants. So now I'd like to go into some more depth in another debiasing project I've been working on for the past couple of years that I believe exemplifies nicely how knowledge about barriers to conflict resolution can feed directly into an intervention to develop a more effective intervention. This project is in collaboration with Emil Bruneau from the University of Pennsylvania, Andres Casas, a Colombian researcher, and Noor Kteili from Northwestern. As I said at the beginning, after years of extremely violent conflict, the Colombian society rejected in a referendum a peace deal signed by the Colombian government and the leadership of the FARC. So the first goal of this research was trying to understand what are the beliefs and attitudes Colombians hold toward FARC that are particularly relevant to their opposition to the peace process. So we adapted an approach from communication studies to the domain of conflict resolution by first conducting and filming a set of semi-structured interviews with members of the Colombian public, you can see here in the background, to identify common concerns about FARC ex-combatants. We identified from these interviews a set of negative conflict-related beliefs about FARC, which included, most notably, the belief that FARC members are unwilling and unable to reintegrate in the Colombian society and give up violence. It should be noted that this set of beliefs is similar to perceived group malleability, or the ability of groups to change over time, which has been highlighted in previous research as a key psychological barrier to peace, and a belief that actually can be changed and can be reduced to promote conflict resolution. Based on these interviews, we conducted a survey among a large sample of Colombians and found that indeed there is high endorsement of these beliefs and that they are highly positively correlated with participants' dehumanization of FARC ex-combatants and negatively correlated with willingness to support the peace process and policies that aim to help ex-combatants reintegrate in the Colombian society. So based on these findings, we decided to develop an intervention that targets this specific set of beliefs. So to develop this media intervention, we established a collaboration with Colombian filmmakers. Together, we interviewed FARC members at the demobilization camp in Antioquia, a region in Colombia that experienced some of the most intense fighting over the course of the conflict. To create realistic and engaging media interventions, we interviewed demobilized FARC members on camera. We designed interview questions that would allow FARC members to express their thoughts about the set of beliefs we aim to target. Specifically in this case, about the willingness and ability to reintegrate in the Colombian society and give up violence. To counter potential resistance to disinformation by Colombians, we also interviewed Colombians from the neighboring town and village, the police maintaining the cordon around the camp, and members of NGOs who work in the camp. So now let's see a short segment of this intervention.
Y todo fue gradualmente, pero fue avanzando. Hasta ahora, pues, creo que hay una muy buena relación, tanto con la comunidad, tanto con el ejército, tanto con la policía.
Pues una de las cosas, primero que todo, es la confianza. O sea, de entrar en confianza, porque la realidad, lo que hemos tenido aquí, la confianza y la integración, porque nosotros no le hemos podido dar nada, más nada. Confianza, integración y amor, afecto, cariño a las comunidades.
Ellos dicen, ¿cuántos de nosotros no queremos que nos muevan de aquí? Porque aquí nosotros venimos, jugamos fútbol con ustedes.
Nos dijeron que hay un equipo de fútbol.
Sí, aquí hay un fútbol mixto.
Claro, mixto.
Sí, policía, soldados, comunidad y excombatientes. Ya se organizó el equipo de fútbol de mujeres. Ya fueron y jugaron en Dabeiba y derrotaron al equipo de allá.
No, hemos trabajado muy de la mano, actividades, arreglada de camino, arregla de carreteras, que una ayuda para una señora pobre allí, que hay que hacer una rifa, que hay que hacer una venta, vender boletas, un bingo, pero que hay que colaborar. Siempre lo hemos hecho.
Nos ha tocado aquí en este espacio trabajar de la mano todos juntos en el arreglo de la carretera. Soldados, policías, defensa civil, las dos comunidades, aquella y esta, nos ha tocado.
So this video continues for approximately 2 to 3 more minutes, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. So using this footage, we created 10 different videos, some specifically targeted the belief about FARC unwillingness and inability to change, as I said. Other videos targeted other beliefs, such as FARC members' honesty or perceived FARC members' honesty by the Colombian society. Also, we examined different iterations of these videos. In some videos, we only showed interviews with FARC members. In others, we showed only interviews with non-FARC individuals. and in some we showed both in different order. We tested all of these videos compared to a no video control condition in an intervention tournament to assess their causal effect. While most videos were relatively effective, especially in the assessment that was immediately after exposure, I'll focus here on one that was especially effective and robust, the video I just showed you. This video targeted the belief about FARC unwillingness and inability to change and showed first the interviews with FARC members, which were then followed by interviews with non-FARC individuals. As can be seen here, compared to the control, which is in black, the video shown in green significantly increased adherence to this belief that we targeted, specifically the belief about FARC unwilling and inability to change. It significantly lowered dehumanization of FARC members and significantly increased support for the peace process and FARC reintegration policies. Importantly, all of these effects persisted when we got back to the same participants after approximately 10 to 12 weeks. It should also be noted that most of the effects that we found that other videos had immediately after exposure actually subsided after these 10 to 12 weeks in the second measurement. And finally, I don't have it here on this slide, but we replicated these results in a third study with a new sample of Colombians. So to summarize, combining methodological techniques from psychology and communications and leveraging scientist-filmmaker collaboration, while also soliciting full participation of members of the involved societies, the present research develops a media intervention and demonstrates its effectiveness in promoting peace after decades of violent conflict. We show here that the intervention succeeds by generating a lasting change in beliefs about the intentions and abilities of outgroup members. This intervention can be scaled up relatively easily. It's a pretty short film or video, and thus has the potential to nudge the Colombian society, as well as perhaps other societies immersed in conflict, towards peace. Currently, although the coronavirus pandemic has obviously harmed our efforts, we are working on developing collaboration that will allow us, hopefully, based on the current regulations in Colombia, to show this video prior to full feature films in cinemas across Colombia. More broadly speaking, I hope that with this study in Colombia, I managed to provide you a taste of my contribution to the research on psychological barriers to attitude change and conflict resolution, and how we can use this knowledge on psychological barriers to develop effective interventions to promote conflict resolution. This work is done when possible and potentially in collaboration with people on the ground that are directly involved in the conflict, as well as creative people, filmmakers or marketing experts that can take this psychological knowledge and translate it to compelling materials. And with that, I'd just like to end by thanking my main mentors and collaborators I've been working with in the past few years, the main funding agencies that funded my work, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amiri, for that extremely, again, inspiring and optimistic presentation, especially in the face of increasing global polarization on a domestic level and on an international level. I certainly hope that we can use your findings to push the world in a more positive and collaborative direction. So thank you for your hard work and for your very inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
Our next presenter comes to the Boris Mints Institute from the School of Economics. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Oren Danieli with a lecture titled Outside Options in the Labor Market. Dr. Danieli.
Hi.
With us, there you are. Take it away.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. It's actually great that we're doing this online because here it's morning in Princeton and I'm glad that I can still join you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, great. Okay, so today I'm here to talk to you about outside options in the labor market. This is a joint work with Sidney Caldwell from UC Berkeley. I apologize that economists' presentations are always so much more boring than other disciplines. We don't have all those nice pictures and movies. So I do hope that the topics would be at least interesting, but we'll work with what we have. Okay, so there are at least two reasons that we know quite well by now that it's important for workers to have more job opportunities or more options, as we call them. Workers that have more options can first just find a better match. So as everything in life, if you have more options to choose from, you can eventually find a better option. So workers that can choose from more jobs, from job options, they can find a job that's closer to where they live, a job that where they get along better with their manager, a job that better fits their skills, etc. And the second reason is that if you have more options, naturally you also have better outside options. So employers would have to pay you higher wages to prevent you from going into other places. So for at least both of those reasons, it's important for workers to have more than just one job option, and probably the more jobs they could go to, the better. Now, the topic of this presentation is that what we think is that the availability of those job opportunities, those options, could actually vary across workers. And this variation could be quite significant and also quite systematic. So let's think about a few examples. So the amount of options for a job that a worker has could depend on their local labor market. Workers that live in big cities like New York City or like Tel Aviv would have access to many jobs around them, where workers that are living in more rural areas won't have as many options to choose from. Another difference could be driven by willingness to commute. Some workers are willing to commute very long distances, and as a result, they get access to more jobs they can work in. Workers that are unable or unwilling to make this long commute will only have to work for jobs that are very close to where they live. The availability of jobs could also depend on the transferability of skills. There are some workers that have skills that are very, very general and can be used in many different workplaces, where there are some workers that have skills that are very specific, in which case they would have fewer options. All of those things could potentially generate lower wages, even for equally productive workers. Let's think through an example that we're going to talk quite a lot about today. People before us have already argued that women may have fewer options on average if they're less willing or less able to commute. So if this is true, and women are basically looking for jobs in a smaller geographical area, what this means is that first, women would find on average worse jobs because they have fewer options to choose from. And second, even conditional on the match quality, even for the same job, they might be earning lower wages because they have worse outside options. Because men are able to drive to those further away jobs, employers might need to pay them more to prevent them from doing so. Now, the challenge in trying to study those topics is that outside options are typically unobserved. In most data sets that we have, we know where workers are working, but we don't know where they could have worked. We don't know which other offers they received or anything like that. So that's going to be the main thing we're going to try to overcome in order to figure out who has more options and does it matter. And more specifically, in this project, what we're trying to do is to answer the following three questions. The first question is, which workers have more options? And because we can't really see those options directly, what we're going to do is we're going to derive what in economics we call a sufficient statistic for outside options, what we're going to call the outside option index. I'm going to explain what this index is in a few slides to give you some intuition about it, but basically it quantifies how much options you have in the labor market. And one of the things we find is that men have about 25% more relevant options compared to similar women. The second question is, does it matter? Or more specifically, how do differences in options actually translate into wages? So the formal way to say that is that we're looking to identify an elasticity between this outside option index and wages, which we're going to do using two natural experiments. And basically what we find is that it actually matters quite a lot. So if you have 10% more relevant options, if for every 10 job options that you have, I'll give you another one, we expect your wages to increase by around 2.2%. So it could actually matter quite a lot for your wages. And then the final question is, how do differences in options affect wage inequality? So we're going to combine what we estimated for this outside option index with the elasticity to figure out the overall impact on the wage distribution. And we estimate that 25% of the gender gap, at least in Germany, where our data is from, is driven by those differences in options, by the fact that men have those have more options. And the main mechanism, at least for the gender gap, is in fact this willingness to commute or to move. So the fact that men are willing or able to take those more distant jobs, that's what gives them more options, and that explains at least about a quarter of the gender gap. So I don't really have time to go into all the mathematical theoretical framework. I'll just tell you that we're using a mathematical model to model the labor market. And from this model, we're able to derive this outside option index, this OOI, and this expression right here. I want you to think of it intuitively. So intuitively, you can think about this expression as the log of the number of options that the worker has, okay? So it quantifies how many options every worker has in the labor market. You can also think of it as an index of concentration. So many times in different industries, we measure how concentrated is the cell phone industry, how concentrated is the supermarket industry, etc. So we actually measure a concentration in the labor market on all observable dimensions at once. So what it means is that if workers that look like you, and by look like you, I mean similar age, from similar places in Germany, similar education, similar training. So if workers that look like you tend to be very concentrated, and they could be concentrated in a specific industry, or they could be concentrated in a specific location, or they could be concentrated only in jobs that don't require them to take night shifts. The more concentrated the workers are, the fewer options they actually have. Or vice versa, if workers are highly dispersed, they can be in every occupation, in every industry, in every location, then we can learn they have a lot of options, and this outside option index is going to be high. So basically what this outside option index is measuring is two main things. The first is the worker flexibility, how much the worker is able to do things like commuting to more distant jobs or work in different occupations. So how flexible they are in taking different jobs. And the second thing is just the job supply in the relevant districts or the occupation. So if there are just more jobs, then this outside option index is going to be higher. So that's basically the idea, try to quantify how much options every worker has. We're estimating this using a data from Germany. It's what we call a linked employer-employee data. We can see both the workers and their employees. So we use information about the workers' demographics, their training, and we know a lot about the jobs. We know many specific things about the jobs like part-time, full-time, the occupation, the industry. And the other important thing that we know is the distance. What's the distance between every worker in every job? Okay, so with this index, we can answer the questions that we started with. And the first question was, who actually has better options? So this is one way of seeing it. Here, we're comparing the outside option index for different groups. So you can see that, for example, females have an outside option index that is lower by around 0.24 compared to males. If you remember, I said this outside option index is about the log of the size of the option set. So what this means is that women have about 25% fewer options compared to males. We also find that non-citizens have about 30% fewer options compared to citizens, and that people with lower levels of education have much fewer options than people with higher levels of education. If you look at this geographically, what we get is that things look pretty reasonable. So in the big cities in Germany, like Berlin, like Munich, like all those cities that I know from their soccer teams, like Dortmund, all those places have a lot of options. So these are the darker areas where workers have more jobs. They have a higher outside option index, so they have more options to choose from. Where in the more rural areas of Germany, workers don't have a lot of options. So living in big cities gives you more options, as we suspected. If you look at occupations, that's actually pretty interesting. So we get that, in fact, higher paid occupations actually have fewer options. So occupations that pay higher wages actually have a lower outside option index. And to figure out why, here we plot the outliers of this graph. So if you look at the top left corner, so these occupations right here, so these are high paying occupations that also have low levels of options. And what you can see here is sort of textbook examples for occupations with very specific skills. So people like medical doctors, like pilots, these are workers that are earning high wages because they have a very high levels of skills. But because those skills are very, very specific, because they can only be used in very specific occupation or in very specific industries, then those workers actually don't have a lot of options. In contrast, workers like meter readers or car salespersons, they earn low wages, but their skills are pretty general and could potentially be used in different occupations. We also show that you can use our outside option index to predict which workers are going to recover fastest from a mass layoff. So a mass layoff is something like a big plant has to shut down or has to reduce its activity. So it has to fire at least a third of its workers. So we can track those workers and see which one of them is able to find a job faster and at what wage. And here in this graph, what we compare is worker with higher levels of options compared to lower levels of options. And you can see that in the first 12 months, workers with higher levels of options are able to regain additional 8% from their previous wages. So kind of naturally, if you have more options, then you're less affected by your plant shutting down. You can find another place and get a wage that is similar to what you had before, versus someone that they don't have a lot of options. So if they lose their job, that's actually much more meaningful. Okay, in the paper, we have a lot of more things you can do with this index, but for the sake of time, I want to move on to the second question, which is basically, does it matter? Or how do differences in options actually translate into wages? In the past, economists used to think that if you have two options, that's enough. If you have only two options, those things would compete, and that would get your wage to the marginal productivity, so that more than two doesn't matter. But in fact, I'm going to show you that it actually does matter. So what we're going to do is we're going to use two, in economics, we call those instruments or natural experiments of things that are increasing workers' option sets, are giving workers more options, but are presumably not affecting their wages in other ways. And specifically, they're not necessarily increasing their productivity. So the first natural experiment is the introduction of high-speed commuter rails in Germany. So in Germany, they expanded their train system and just added stations along existing routes. And so very small German cities suddenly got access to a lot of jobs in big cities. And the second natural experiment is what we call a shift-share instrument in economics, where basically the idea here is that we're comparing workers within the same industry, but they live in different parts of Germany, so they have outside options in different industries. So for example, two workers in manufacturing, one lives in Munich and the other lives in some rural area in Germany. The one in Munich maybe see a growth in their outside options because other industries in Munich are growing, and so they have more options of places they could move to. So both of those natural experiments give us pretty similar results, where basically it's somewhere around the area of 0.2 or 0.3. So something like 10% more options translate to about 2.5% higher wages. So it does mean quite a lot. So intuitively, if instead of having 10 job opportunities, now you have 11 job opportunities, we think this would mean that you would get a wage that is about 2 to 3% higher. So it does matter. Okay, and the final question is, how do differences in options actually affect wage inequality? So we're going to take the estimates of who has better options and combine this with the estimates of how much does it matter for wages and do the math of what's the overall impact overall. So these are just some basic facts on inequality in Germany, what we call in economics the wage premium. So the wage premium for being a male is 19 log points, about 19%. So males in Germany are earning about 19% higher wages compared to similar females. And similarly, citizens are earning about 9% higher wages, and people with higher levels of education are earning around 20–30% higher levels of wages. Now, the part in red is the part that we can explain with our outside option index. So from the gender gap, from the full 19% gap, 5%, which is about a quarter of the overall gap, is because men have more options than women. So the math here is pretty simple. So if men have about 25% more options than females, and 10% more options means 2% higher wages, you do the math and you get that men should be earning around 5% higher wages than women just because they have more options. So it's not the only reason for the gender gap. There's still all those other reasons why men are earning higher wages compared to women, but it's still a substantial portion out of it. It also explains substantial portions out of why citizens are earning higher wages and why people with higher levels of education are earning higher wages and why people in big cities are earning higher wages. So it does matter for inequality. Then we, of course, ask why. Why, in fact, women have fewer options? And there could be multiple explanations for it. But in fact, there's only one explanation that seems to be particularly important, and maybe even the only explanation. And that's the gap that's being driven by those differences in commute. So without going into the details, I'll tell you that if you do the math of what would happen if men and women would have the same ability to drive longer distances, you get that this would close the gender gap by around 6%, which is even more than the full gap that we estimated that's related to differences in options. So basically, if men and women had the same ability to take more distant jobs, either to drive there or to even move for a more distant location, then what we would get that a quarter of the gender gap in Germany would be eliminated. So we can reduce the gender gap by 1/4. Okay, so that's about it. So this project basically shows you which workers have better outside options. They tend to be males, German citizens, urban residents. It shows that it matters for wages. So 10% more options increases wages by around 2.2%. It actually explains some big portions of wage inequality. It explains about a quarter of the gender gap. It also explained about 20% of the returns to higher education. So it does seem to be a pretty meaningful thing in thinking about inequality. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Danieli, for that presentation. It certainly is calming in terms of the building of the light rail in Tel Aviv and the future options that we will have for working after the construction is done, God knows when. But very, very important work, especially as we are kind of aiming towards policy solutions that do close the gender gap and create more equity and equality for everyone, citizens or not. So thank you so much for that research. Very, very stimulating. And welcome to the Boris Mints Institute. We are very happy to have you.
Thank you.
And so with that, we will move on to our third presentation by Dr. Yitzhak Sasson, who we have had the pleasure of hosting at the Boris Mints Institute before. And he's going to be speaking to us about the changing locus of lifespan inequality in the United States. He comes to us from the fields of sociology and anthropology. And so welcome, Dr. Sasson. Very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Ian. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Boris Mints and the Boris Mints Institute for supporting my demography lab. Just recently joined the Institute. And today I'd like to give you a taste of part of the research that goes on in my lab. And this is something that I've been working on for quite a few years, and I'm slowly published quite a lot about the more technical aspects and more empirical aspects of what I'm going to show you today. But today I'd like to move slowly toward maybe speculating or hypothesizing about what are the underlying social causes of the trends that I'm going to show you. So just like my previous talk, I'd like to begin with a big historical exposition. And a lot of my work in the past few years has been surrounding lifespan inequality. So basically inter-individual inequality in the age of death. And in this case, the figure that I'm showing you here, these are data from the Human Mortality Database. It has about 20 countries, mostly high-income countries, and dating back about 2 centuries. And what we see here is basically the Gini index or the Gini coefficient. Just like we can measure the Gini of income inequality, we can also use the same index to measure inequality in age of death. And I think the good news is that we can see from this figure is that over the past 200 years, or since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen inequality in ages of death decline substantially. So if, for example, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Gini index was closer to 0.5. Just to remind, the Gini varies from 0 to 1. 0 is perfect equality, 1 is perfect inequality. So the Gini was almost 0.5 200 years ago, and now we're almost down to 0.1. So this is quite a remarkable achievement. And a lot of this achievement had to do with the reduction in child and infant mortality. So you can see that this wasn't consistent. We have a lot of spikes and fluctuations. Some of them you can probably guess that they're related to, for example, you can see here the First World War. So we see an increase in inequality because more young people die, especially men in this case. The same thing occurring in around World War II. The black curve is the average trend, but we can see the very different countries. Of course, Sweden would not have this spike in inequality, but other countries participating in the war would obviously have it. For example, Japan came out after the war with very large inequality, and then we see a decline to present day. So this is the long-term view. But the big problem is that we're facing, and has received a lot of attention in the demographic and sociological literature in the last couple of decades, basically has to do with this puzzle. So on the one hand, we've seen increased equality in human lifespans, but at the same time, we know that social inequalities in mortality, in life expectancy, in longevity persist, and even in high-income countries, and in some countries, and many of them indeed, they're even growing. So the total inequality in length of life is declining, as I mentioned earlier, mostly because of historical declines in infant and child mortality. But the flip side of this is that social inequalities in life expectancy, for example, between men and women, between race or ethnic groups, between socioeconomic groups or social classes are actually persistent and even increasing in some countries. And the sort of the line of reasoning that I would like to advance here is that mortality inequalities often mirror other dimensions of social inequality, and especially the ones that I mentioned, although there are many other dimensions. But being a sociologist, I will focus on class, social class, gender, and race. But of course, you can think of many other social determinants of health and mortality that are not included here and possibly becoming increasingly important. For example, nativity, if you look at migrant mortality and so on. So this project, or what I'm going to show you today, is basically part of a project that aims at understanding how these social inequalities in length of life have changed over time. And I would like to again adopt a big picture view of these trends and maybe build up on the previous research that I've done. So I think I showed this slide in the last webinar as well, but today I'd like to focus particularly on this result here. And again, this is actually pulling together several different studies. Some of them are my own, some of them are by colleagues. But what we're finding here, this is basically on the y-axis, we see the gap in life expectancy between the high and low education groups. It could be college educated versus high school educated, for example. The definitions vary a little bit from country to country. But roughly, if we look at the gap in life expectancy, we see that it increased in the last 50 years for both men and women. And surprisingly, it increased in a variety of very different countries. So we can see the US and Finland and Spain and Israel. And there are many other countries that I just, in the interest of time, I won't show you. But countries with seemingly very different sociopolitical contexts still have the same overall trend toward increasing inequality, in this case by education, but we can think of education as a marker of socioeconomic status, or SES. And then to convince you that this is not only, a lot of times I give these talks and people tell me, well, do you focus on the US? And the US is exceptional, the notorious American exceptionalism. But then a couple of years ago, with some colleagues, we published this paper in Science that basically replicates these results and shows roughly the same trend in Finland, which is one of the most egalitarian welfare states today, has a very low, for example, income inequality and so on. And here we see pretty much the same image, not as bad as the US, but we see the gap is growing between education groups, between occupational classes, between income quantiles or quintiles. And this is quintile, there's a typo here. But so we see this basically in every country that we look at these high income countries, and we see the same trend across multiple markers of socioeconomic status. Now, this is where a lot of studies end, including my own. But then if you look at the flip side and you look at, for example, gender inequality and race inequality, mostly in the US, but other countries as well, you find a very different trend. So here I'm showing you again from those 17 countries, high income countries from the Human Mortality Database. These are the different countries, and the red curve is the average trend across all of these countries. And here we see the female advantage in life expectancy. So basically how many years on average women live more than men. And we see that obviously, this is not news for anyone here, but women tend to live longer than men on average. But the interesting thing is that we see a lot of variation between countries, but quite surprisingly, all of those countries seem to have moved in the same direction. So in the 50s, we had roughly or very maybe low inequality. Then it goes up, the female advantage increases. roughly until the 70s and 80s. Then it starts declining and reaches the same levels as the 1950s. We can break it down by country, but we don't have the time. But for example, in English-speaking countries, this decline started earlier in the late 60s in the UK, in early and mid 70s in the US, in Canada. We see it in continental Europe in the 80s. But roughly, this is moving in concert. So we see this increase in inequality by gender and then a decline. I'll give you maybe one reason for this, although I'm not going to be focusing a lot on this figure here, is that about half of this decline in the gap is because of smoking behavior. So basically, men have, if in the 1950s, about roughly 50% of male cohorts would have had smoked in these countries, and very low proportion of women. We've seen over time that men on average smoke less, and women smoking prevalence increases. So they caught up with men almost, and this is partly behind this gap, but it doesn't account for all of it. But roughly, we see this hump-shaped curve that is pretty much shared by all countries in spite of their differences. Now I'm going to focus only in the US because this is where we see the white and black gap in life expectancy at birth. It still exists, it's very persistent, but there's a positive note that we've seen since it peaked around 1989 at about 7-year difference between whites and blacks. So basically, we're showing here a 7-year advantage in white life expectancy compared to non-Hispanic blacks. It declined by about 50% by 2014. So just to recap, we've seen an increase in inequality based on SES, but decline in inequality based on gender and race, at least in the US. The question is, so I showed you these descriptive trends, or descriptive findings, but the question is, can we maybe formalize this or pursue this more rigorously? This is exactly what I've done here in this project with a colleague, Iñaki Perlmuñer, from the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona, where I spent part of my sabbatical last fall. And we've came up with this decomposition. I won't get into the details. It turns out that it is quite a messy and mathematically intractable problem to decompose the Gini or the Thiel index or other indices of inequality. Some of them are additive, but once you try to decompose it to multiple factors, it becomes mathematically intractable, or sometimes it's very sensitive to the ordering of categories, but this is a lot of methodological detail. But for now, I will just focus on this very simple decomposition that we've developed that only for now looks at between group variation in life expectancy. And we decompose it by sex, race, and education. So basically, this is the total variation in life expectancy between these three factors. And then we decompose it and how much of this variation is due to sex or gender inequality or differences in life expectancy, how much is due to race inequality, and how much is due to educational inequality. There's some limitations to this decomposition. We solved some of them. I don't want to get into the details, but this is maybe for the Q&A if anyone is interested. But I'd love to move on directly to the results. And these are the findings the main findings I'd like to show you today. And I think this is, in less than 30 years, we've seen quite a dramatic shift in the determinants of inequality in length of life in the United States. And again, this is just focusing in the US, but we have plans to replicate this in other countries, such as Finland, such as Spain, hopefully Israel as well as other countries. So what we're seeing here is that this is the y-axis of the vertical axis is the variation between group variation in life expectancy. And this is an absolute value, so the years of variation. And we see the total is declined toward the 2000, was pretty stable until 2010, and then increased again. And you probably heard about the opioid epidemic that is increasing mortality in the United States. This is part of it. But the more interesting part that I'd like to focus on today is the breakdown by these three factors. So if in 1990, 61% of the total variation in those factors in life expectancy was attributed to gender differences. And about 27% was due to race, and slightly less than 12% was due to education. Fast forward 27 years to 2017, and here we're seeing that only 30% is due to sex, so still quite substantial, but declined by about half. The race gap actually accounts for 3% of the inequality in life expectancy, and about 2/3 are attributed to SES. In this case, I'm measuring SES via educational attainment. So this is quite a remarkable shift. And of course, you can think about other confounders, other explanations that some people have. For example, the changing educational composition and so on. Again, I don't want to get into the technical details, but we actually fixed the population shares in the average between these two periods. So this is actually net of the compositional change in education and so on. Again, we can reserve some of that for the Q&A. So now I'd like to discuss possible explanations. I think part of what we all know, we've witnessed the gender revolution, famously by Paula England and other, obviously, scholars, that have shown that in recent decades there's been reduced gender differentiation, at least in education and work. I would add the masculinization of women's health behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, women have caught up with men, for example, in terms of smoking. So smoking has become predominantly class-based rather than gender-based. We can, I think, maybe attribute some of it to the declining significance of race. This is a highly controversial book from 1978, but I don't want to emphasize, spend too much time on this. I'd like to actually focus on the SES part, which is becoming the dominant or primary predictor of longevity. And here I would like to take a broader overview of the social political context. And I'm trying to, maybe you can help me with this, but I'm trying to think of recent frameworks to think about this. And I found two very interesting ones. One of them is Branko Milanovic, the famous economist, who published Capitalism Alone last year. And the other one is Michael Sandel with The Tyranny of Merit. And I think this is how I would like to tie this, or this for me ties to what we're seeing in terms of inequality and mortality. But basically what Milanovic is saying, that unlike previous forms of capitalism since the 1980s in the US, but in other countries as well, we've seen the emergence of liberal meritocratic capitalism that has three attributes that are quite different from previous forms of capitalism. One is that the capital-rich individuals are now also labor-rich. This is Piketty's super managers, the rise of super managers. So they also have higher human capital. So these are not just the Marxian capitalists, they're actually professionals, managers who work and also have capital income. The second attribute is assortative mating. We see positive correlation between partners' education and earnings, but both of them are working as opposed to the past. And maybe most importantly, we see higher intergenerational transmission of wealth, income, and human capital due to rising costs of education and reduced taxation on inheritance and so on. So these factors combined contribute to increase in income inequality and under the semblance of a meritocracy. And basically, I will finish with this slide. So how is this related to mortality? So I think I've been thinking about this from the viewpoint of maybe on the meritocracy and unmeritocracy and longevity. And I'm thinking that we live in an era that definitely economically and politically is subscribed largely to this idea of merit. And Michael Sandel recently published a book, The Tyranny of Merit. He writes about the meritocratic hubris. He says the relentless emphasis in creating a fair meritocracy in which social positions reflect effort and talent has a corrosive effect on the way in which we interpret our success or lack of it. So I think the same winner-takes-all mentality has increasingly shaped health policies since the 1980s. And there's been some research on that have placed greater emphasis on personal choices and resources. So increasingly, it's not just our income that is based on how well we perform in the market, but it is also our health and eventually mortality. So I call this the emergence of a so-called meritocracy of longevity, but of course we're thinking here of meritocracy as a very contentious term under these two frameworks. So this is basically where this project is now. And in the next steps, we would like to replicate this in other countries, explore interaction effects between those three components, and think of the implications for distributive justice. But I think maybe a final note is that, as I said, under the guise of meritocracy, there is a moral value attached to it. So people who live longer are actually, it's considered today as something that is perhaps morally just, because they have earned it in a certain way, their income, their education, their health lifestyle, so they deserve it. Unlike previous forms of inequality that have been very difficult to justify. And I think this is part of what the change we're seeing today over the last several decades. So again, my collaborators, and thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Sasson. I mean, it really certainly raises the stakes for solving issues of relative and absolute inequality. Our lives literally depend on it. So that's quite a lot to sit with, I think, in terms of our policy goals moving forward. Thank you so much for that really inspiring piece of content. Last but certainly not least, one of the prides of our department, Karen Umansky, who's going to be giving us an overview of her project that she's just completed, entitled "A New Era of Radical Populism in European Politics, a Challenge or an Opportunity." Certainly topical and relevant. Karen, the floor is yours, and mazal tov to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And last but not least, and I'm very happy to be here today, and I would like to thank the Boris Mints Institute, and of course Itai and Ayelet for supporting me throughout this journey. It was a long journey, but eventually it ended up successfully. And just let me share my screen for a second. Okay. Perfect. So if you remember, if you can still remember the pre-corona times, you might also remember that before COVID-19, people, regardless of their political affiliation, were quite preoccupied with the changes in the political sphere in Western democracies. A new type of parties and politicians were gaining more and more attention, and some referred to these new political actors as populist or called them radicalists. Others just claimed that there is nothing radical about them and they're just the new mainstream. And this funny caricature, which I found online, illustrates how Europe these days is being torn apart between the regulations of the European Union, which is striving to preserve the status quo, of course, and the so-called new radical forces, whose main slogans are bringing power back to the people and restoring national dignity and sovereignty in the face of the bureaucratic and technocratic demands of the European Union. And of course, the European Union is blamed for choosing corporate neoliberal interests over the representation of the common people. And among others, we can see over here examples of the FPÖ, of the Austrian FPÖ, of the Italian Lega Nord, and of course, this blonde lady is Marine Le Pen from Front National in France. So, why does it not? Okay. Looking at this new face of Europe as a political scientist, I immediately saw an opportunity for an interesting project. I set some objectives, wondering how these parties became so successful for allegedly small, radical, so-called niche parties, and how, if at all, they influence the sphere of European politics. And exploring parties' electoral behavior, I came up with the notion of legitimate enemy. Some of you may be familiar with it already. Put simply, it means that parties blame a so-called enemy for the most pervading public concerns, such as poor economy, inflation, housing shortages, and even environmental problems. And this creates a feeling of threat and divides the society into us and them. We are the poor people suffering from all these problems, as opposed to them who are pictured as an enemy and the cause of all the troubles that people are suffering from. And this state of conflict helps transform collective beliefs quicker and more effectively, urging individuals to take a side in the face of the threat, which is commonly, of course, translated into electoral success of these new radical parties. Because people go to the ballot box and faced with the problem and faced with the trouble, and in the face of fear, just vote at the ballot box accordingly. So how do NRPs or new radical parties come up with these enemies? They choose issues that are important in the eyes of voters, but neglected by the establishment, and attack the establishment for neglecting these issues. Thus, government, the European Union, and even immigrants can pose as a legitimate enemy in the populist radical rhetoric. In fact, anti-establishment and anti-immigration dimensions were marked as the new additional dimensions of today's politics, in addition to the two well-used dimensions, one of them being the left-right and the other one being more libertarian or authoritarian. Which makes it safe to say that contemporary political sphere can and should be regarded as multidimensional. At least we have 4 dimensions, and maybe we have even more. So I tested my theory in several case studies and in my dissertation, and I'm happy to present you the results from one of the case studies today. These are the leaders of the Alternative for Germany party, Alice Weidel and Alexander Gauland. So why Germany? First of all, I think it's fair to say that Germany is the driving force of Europe and sets the tone in so many aspects in the European Union. And second, Germany, because of its past, has been less tolerant to the radical discourse than other European countries. And many radical or extreme right parties were either banned over here or didn't gain enough votes to enter the Bundestag, which is the German parliament. So it was quite interesting to see if and how a new radical right party became the 3rd largest party in the German parliament in 2017. And finally, on a personal note, I happen to live in Germany now, as you have heard already, and it is particularly interesting to follow the topic of my research from such a short distance. So let's have a look. The AfD, or Alternative for Germany, für Deutschland, started just a few months before the 2013 German election. And it started as an anti-Euro single-issue party. But it made a very interesting and sharp turn in its ideology in 2017, which in my view contributed to its success. Failing to meet the electoral threshold in 2013, it became the 3rd largest party in the Bundestag following the 2017 election. Over here we can see that the success of the AfD was partially at the expense of the support, the decreasing support for CDU, for the center-right CDU, and for the center-left SPD. Over here we have the Christian Democrats, and over here we have the Social Democrats, of course. So if new radical parties thrive on overlooked public concerns, which is what I'm saying in my dissertation, let's have a look at what German people were concerned with before the elections. And if we look at 2013 and 2017, you can see in dark blue public concerns on the eve of the election in 2013. It's quite obvious that following the economic crisis and the accumulation of government debts in the Eurozone, people were mostly concerned with economic issues and government debt.
I mean, these are pretty salient results over here. However, in 2017, which is light blue over here, we can see that these concerns have decreased. Concerns with economic situation, rising prices and inflation, unemployment, and government debt almost stopped. People almost stopped being concerned with government debt at all. Instead, following the 2015 European refugee crisis, concerns with immigration and terrorism became the most prominent. So I analyzed party manifestos in both elections, looking for issues that parties addressed the most, also known as salience, issue salience, and of course the context in which these issues were used, whether it was negative, whether it was positive or neutral. I did so in order to understand which dimensions parties capitalized most, and on which issues they addressed most, and which issues were addressed to a lesser extent or ignored altogether. So in 2013, which is this figure from 2013, it was a classic illustration of a two-dimensional political sphere. We can see here two dimensions of economy and unemployment, and government and politics, and most of the parties addressed these issues because they were the main public concerns during that time. So the issues were attended, bravo, representative democracy at work. However, in 2017, the picture was entirely different. If you remember from one of the previous slides, two main public concerns in 2017 were immigration and terrorism. And have a look at what parties are focusing in 2017. Again, we see economy and government and politics being the main dimensions. And most of the parties avoided almost completely the so-called uncomfortable issue of immigration. This disconnect or misrepresentation, if you will, created a gap between the people and the establishment, which is supposed to represent the people. But one party was attentive enough and listened to the people, and this was the AfD. And the AfD holds an almost complete ownership of this issue of immigration and has actually a lot to say about the government and the government's open door immigration policy as well. And in my research, I argued that this was a window of opportunity that the AfD used in its advantage in order to enter the sphere of German politics and gain the unprecedented for the post-World War II times electoral success for a new radical right party. To estimate AfD's impact on the sphere of politics, I used a technique which is called the uncovered set. It is a mathematical algorithm of figuring out where is the center of the political sphere and how it moves and how it changes. New radical parties, according to my theory, will have effect if their appearance will change the shape, size, or location of the uncovered set. So this cube over here is a homage to a multidimensional political sphere. We have only three dimensions here for the sake of simplicity, which is government, immigration, and the economic dimension over here. So dimensions run from negative values, which are on the left side and the bottom side of the cube, to the positive values, which are on the right side of the cube and the upper part of the cube. So what we can see over here is that it's quite clear that most of the parties in Germany are located very close to each other, except for the AfD. AfD holds an explicitly negative position on both immigration and the government because the party is situated over here. And this little blue star is the uncovered set for the 2013 election. And this little red star is the uncovered set for the 2017 selection. So we can see actually that the entry of the new actor into the political sphere moved the uncovered set of all legislative outcomes to the side of the new entrant of the AfD. It moved into the negative position. However, the size of the uncovered set didn't change, meaning that it didn't grow bigger and it didn't introduce a lot of disturbance into the political sphere. And this was because the two main parties that I talked about before, the CDU and the SPD, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, have a very strong hold of the political sphere in Germany, and they managed to contain actually this radical right outburst, if we put it this way. And if we have a look at the shifts in parties' position, which is also quite an interesting thing over here, it's quite clear that most of the parties not only didn't change their position in a more negative direction, on the contrary, many of them have become more pro-immigration, leaving the AfD alone in the negative zone. So how popular is AfD today? I would say that it's quite, we can look at this picture, Islamisierung stoppen, stop Islamization of Germany, and we can understand that maybe Germany, under the lead of the AfD, is sliding back to the days of old radicalism. But sometimes the media doesn't stress enough the other side of the story. The AfD, despite its initial success, is not necessarily very popular among the Germans. And over here we can see Stop die AfD. People are expressing their discontent with the fact that AfD is even in the Bundestag, is even in the parliament. And many of them oppose the party, its ideology, and its leaders. Also, in the middle of this year, following a successful management of the COVID-19 crisis, people were very supportive of the establishment and not of the challenger parties. We can see over here in blue, populists, the support for the populists has gone down in June 2020 compared to March 2017 and the previous years as well. And unpopulists, which is gray, people started to support the establishment much more. However, recently we have had over here these so-called hygiene demonstrations. They have erupted all across Germany, and initially they were organized to protest against social distancing measures during COVID-19. And they also drew an unlikely mixture of groups, from anti-immigration extremists to right-wing populists and even conspiracy theorists to leftists and anti-capitalist protesters. People just were fed up with the COVID-19 and the social distancing measures. But what is interesting that while, as they say, cleanliness is next to godliness, hygiene was ideologically instrumentalized from an everyday notion of cleanliness to deeming unhygienic the poor, the foreigners, or other people that society wanted to exclude. So it was a norms of exclusion of the unwanted out groups. And these kinds of metaphorical distortions are, of course, quite familiar. We are familiar with them pretty well. And that led to the notion of racial hygiene and the Nazi policy of extermination back in those days. And these days, hygiene demos provide the ground for voicing similar ideas today. And it's quite a new phenomenon, but it's still unclear where Germany is heading with this. And it will be quite interesting to see. And finally, last but not least, the title of my presentation was A New Era of Radical Politics in Europe, a Challenge or an Opportunity, and I feel like I owe you an answer to the question. So in my opinion, the new politics definitely challenges the new liberal aspect of democracy and the Western and liberal point of view that has dominated the European discourse since the 1970s. However, since many liberal elites have become so technocratic and bureaucratic and estranged to the voice of the people, it seems that populism has become a legitimate, although oftentimes illiberal, response to undemocratic liberalism. And the recent area of politics is a wake-up call for democratic societies, a call for listening to the people and attending to their needs, in my opinion. So thank you so much for listening. And if we have time for Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That extremely important analysis. I would love to hear what you have to say about what's going on in the United States as well. These trends are certainly global and really need to be unpacked. So thank you so much for that. And again, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
And I guess in the 10 minutes or so that we have left, we can open up some questions from our presenters, from our audience, from the board. If you want to throw your questions into the chat or into the Q&A, I'm happy to read them aloud to the presenters. And if anyone would like to make any closing statements, I invite you to do so. So I'll wait to see if questions come into the chat and we'll start rattling them off. Other than that, Itai, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I would just like to give a second for anyone who wants to raise a question, and if not, I will make some concluding remarks. So I will count till 15.
I guess everyone's presentations must have been so clear and so straightforward that no one has a single question.
So I think that the most impressive, I was listening to this, and this is the third or the fourth webinar that we have put together, and two things came to mind that I think are worth noting. For one, I really think that we should congratulate Boris Mints and the entire organization for having such remarkable researchers of such different fields showing up again and again and again in these webinars. And this is exceptional. I want those who listen to us to appreciate the fact that this is exceptional. For a research institute to have such an impact on so many fields, so many exceptional researchers like we heard today and in previous webinars, this is, I believe, quite an achievement. And I think it owes a lot to the vision that Boris Mints came to us at the outset and the structure that we put around his vision by his inspiration. It is quite amazing how much we got covered in such a short period of time. The second thing that comes to mind is, going back to Karen's title and switching it to coronavirus, and the reason why I always remain optimistic is the coronavirus or COVID-19 has really challenged our lives in more ways than anyone could imagine, and the effect, the negative effect that it has had, will remain with us for many years. But going back to Alex Pesov's comment on the thing that will change and how they will or may change, previous discussions that we had earlier today, there is an enormous opportunity coming with this enormous tragedy. And in particular, this ability to put these webinars where Oren Danieli joins us from Princeton and Karen from Berlin, and so many individuals are able to attend and watch, including Sekenet Kalimu from Nairobi. That is something that, just like Liat Kishon-Rabin mentioned earlier, overnight, all of a sudden, the meetings of the institutes that were usually reserved exclusively to those who could make the trip to Tel Aviv, could make their way into this small gathering room where I sit right now, and the numbers would be several dozens at best. All of a sudden, we can join forces from Princeton and Berlin and Tel Aviv, and of course Boris Mints himself, who sits in London, and Prof, who sits in Moscow, and all the members of our board that are everywhere, in Montenegro, in Washington, D.C., and so many other places, Armenia and others. This is actually a new world where intellectual and research conversations can also take place in such ease across continents and oceans, and the audience can enjoy them and get what we've seen today, which are really cutting-edge research happening as we speak. We always, I used to go into classrooms and tell my students, when I give you an article to read, the research was done anywhere between 3 or 4 years ago. If I send you to read a book, it was made probably 10 years ago. And now all of a sudden we can really open, and the website of the Institute is always open, and these things always show up, and people can see this research by Boaz or Itzhak or Karen, that they completed. Karen completed these last slides 4 weeks ago. That's, and I suspect Boaz and Itzhak and Oren has made some of this research or weeks or months ago. And it's very important for the future of knowledge that we can actually make available. And also going back to the issues that preoccupies Yitzhak Sasson of equality and inequality. And it is true that these webinars are not available to everybody, but they're free. And so maybe another issue that we should look at is how do we make them accessible to people with less education, because, and I really want to congratulate the 4 researchers of today. Contrary to what Oren warned us against, this was quite straightforward, quite clear. You do not need a PhD in economics to understand the basic storyline that Oren was telling, or that Yitzhak Sasson was making, or Karen or Boaz. And so it is really a new era where very deep research and very important research is made available to high school kids, to students who just entered the university. And I once again want to conclude with thanking Dr. Boris Mints for making all of this possible, because it is literally magic. So thank you very much. And hopefully everybody stays healthy, and we really appreciate your participation. Thank you very much.